All right, so remember all that talk about congestion pricing in New York City, charging drivers to get into the busiest parts of Manhattan.
Yeah,
Well, get this, the whole thing just got kind of flipped on its head.
it sure did. Like just a few weeks ago on January 5th, New York City actually went live with this, pretty ambitious program, slapping tolls on vehicles entering Manhattan below 60th Street. The goal, try to tame that, just notorious New York City traffic
Right.
and, of course, bring in some much-needed cash for the MTA, the city's public transit system.
And it wasn't exactly subtle, was it? I mean,
No.
passenger cars got hit with a $9 fee.
Right.
But the real, kicker was that $21.60 toll for large trucks.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine the impact on businesses just trying to get deliveries done?
Oh, it definitely made waves. And, even with the tolls in place, there were reports of drivers finding creative ways to avoid them.
Welcome to Logistics Pulse, sponsored by Mothership. Skip the broker to save big on LTL shipments, or deliver same day nationwide. For more insights like these, don't forget to subscribe to Logistics Pulse on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
But here's the real shocker. The Federal Department of Transportation, the DOT, just stepped in and basically pulled the plug on the whole thing.
What?
They rescinded their approval.
Okay, hold on. I'm confused.
Yeah.
What prompted the feds to suddenly slam the brakes like this?
Well, Transportation Secretary Duffy sent a pretty strongly worded letter to Governor Hochul outlining some serious concerns.
Okay.
One of the big ones was fairness. He argued that the program was unfairly burdening commuters,
Right.
especially those who are already paying taxes for the city's infrastructure.
Yeah.
Duffy also pointed out the lack of any real free alternative routes for drivers.
Okay.
And he highlighted the potential for a disproportionate impact on people driving in from neighboring states,
Right.
like New Jersey and Connecticut.
So it sounds like there were some logistical and fairness issues that the DOT wasn't happy about. But didn't you say they also felt like the program wasn't really about reducing congestion in the first place?
Right. That's the other major point. The DOT actually went so far as to say that the program was more about filling the MTA's coffers than genuinely trying to tackle the problem of congestion.
Wow.
And remember, this whole thing was initially approved as a pilot program, a trial run, if you will,
Yeah.
under something called the Value Pricing Pilot Program, or VPPP.
Right.
The DOP is arguing that relying on this toll revenue to fund the MTA long-term just wasn't a justifiable approach.
Interesting. So it wasn't just the practicality of the program,
Right.
but also the fundamental purpose and the long-term viability of the funding model that
Exactly.
raised red flags.
Yeah, they essentially felt that the city was veering away from the original intention of the VPPP, which was to use these tolls to incentivize drivers to change their behavior and actually reduce congestion,
Yeah.
not just become a new revenue stream.
Makes sense. And speaking of differing opinions, it's worth pointing out that New Yorkers themselves had some pretty mixed feelings about this whole congestion pricing experiment.
Oh, yeah.
I bet I can't imagine a policy like this not being a bit controversial.
Some people were totally on board with the idea. They saw it as a necessary step to finally deal with the city's traffic nightmare and to provide some much-needed funding for the MTA, which has been struggling financially for years.
Right.
But then there were plenty of others who felt like it was just an unfair burden, specifically the New York trucking industry. In fact, one group, the Trucking Association of New York, even filed a lawsuit to try to block it. To start, can you tell us a little bit about this lawsuit against the MTA?
Sure. So the MTA, of course, runs the subways and buses in New York. And Tanny's lawsuit against them was a big deal because it really highlighted the potential economic impact of congestion pricing, and not just on the trucking industry itself, but on the city as a whole.
So what were their major gripes?
Well, one of the biggest issues was the proposed toll structure. Trucks were going to be charged between $24 and $36 each time they entered Manhattan below 60th Street,
Wow.
depending on the size of the truck. And this is per trip. Passenger vehicles, on the other hand, would only be charged $9
Per day.
per day.
Okay.
So Tanny argued that this disparity was huge, especially when you consider that trucks only make up about 4% of the traffic in the city, compared to passenger vehicles, which account for about 87%.
Oh, wow. So it's a pretty big difference there. So I can understand why they would feel a little bit singled out.
Absolutely.
But isn't the whole point of this to discourage driving and encourage people to use public transportation?
Right.
Trucks can't exactly hop on the subway?
That's exactly what Tanny pointed out.
Okay.
They were basically like, look, trucks are a vital part of the city's supply chain. They deliver food, construction materials, all sorts of essential goods. And these extra costs from congestion pricing are only going to hurt businesses and consumers. They argued that the MTA was essentially putting an unfair burden on an industry that can't avoid driving in those congested zones.
That's a really good point. So beyond just the higher delivery fees, what were some of the other potential consequences that they were concerned about?
So it goes a lot deeper than just delivery fees. Think about it from the perspective of a small business owner. These increased trucking costs could force them to raise prices on their products.
Right.
They might have to cut back on services, or in some cases, they might even have to consider moving their business out of the city completely.
Yeah.
And if this happens on a large scale, it could have a really negative impact on the city's economy.
So you're talking job losses.
Potentially, yeah. Job losses, decrease in property values, even a drop in the city's tax revenue.
Wow, okay, so it really could have a ripple effect throughout the entire city.
Absolutely.
And on top of all this, didn't the MTA need to raise a significant amount of money from congestion pricing?
Yes. The MTA was required by law to generate at least $1 billion a year through congestion pricing
Okay.
to fund improvements to the public transit system, which, as everyone who lives in New York knows, is desperately in need of an upgrade.
Right.
So there was this immense pressure on them to make congestion pricing work and to find ways to bring in revenue, and they thought that the trucking industry would be a good place to start, which landed them in hot water with Tanny.
It sounds like a really tricky situation for everyone.
Definitely.
It just goes to show how complex this whole issue is.
It seems like no matter how carefully you plan these things, there are always unintended consequences and workarounds people will find.
Yeah.
But I imagine the business community in particular must have been keeping a close eye on this whole situation.
Oh, absolutely. Those tolls weren't just a headache for individual drivers.
Makes sense. What kind of specific impacts were businesses facing?
Well, think about it. Every single delivery,
Uh-huh.
every service call, all of a sudden became more expensive
Right.
because of those tolls.
So we're talking about like increased operating costs for businesses,
Yeah,
potentially squeezed profit margins,
right.
and maybe even disruptions to the supply chain itself.
Exactly. And for businesses that are already operating on really thin margins,
Yeah.
those extra costs, even if they seem small on the surface, could really be the difference between making it and barely scraping by.
Right.
So the removal of these tolls could be a huge sigh of relief
Yeah.
for a lot of business owners.
I can see why they'd be celebrating, but I'm curious, some people might argue that businesses will just pocket those savings from the removed tolls
Right.
instead of passing them on to consumers.
Yeah,
What's your take on that?
that's a great question. And it's really hard to say for sure how it will play out.
Right.
Some businesses may indeed choose to hold on to those extra profits,
Sure.
but others may see this as an opportunity to lower prices, become more competitively, attract new customers. It'll be interesting to see how the market adjusts now that this added cost has been removed.
It's a fascinating experiment in a way, isn't it? We'll have to keep an eye on how it unfolds. But let's talk about those potential benefits a little more. And if the tolls are gone, what can businesses realistically expect to see happen?
Well, first and foremost, that translates to reduced operating costs practically overnight,
Right.
which can be a real game changer for their bottom line.
It's certainly a welcome change for them. But what about the impact on traffic itself? Do we think things will actually improve now that those toll booths are gone, or is that just wishful thinking?
It's hard to say for certain,
Right.
but it's definitely a possibility. We could see smoother and more predictable travel times for commercial vehicles, making deliveries and service calls.
Okay, now that does sound pretty good. So we've got reduced costs, smoother traffic flow. Those are some pretty significant perks for businesses in the city.
Yeah.
But what can they actually do to really capitalize on this sudden shift?
Well, for starters, I'd say any business that adjusted their pricing because of the tolls should dust off those old models
Okay.
and see if it's time to bring prices back down to stay competitive.
Smart move. Any other tips for businesses navigating this post-toll world?
One thing I'd strongly suggest is for businesses to actively engage with their local business associations and really advocate for policies that support both economic growth and smart forward-thinking infrastructure improvements. This is a chance for them to have their voices heard and help shape the future of the city in a way that benefits everyone.
That's a great point. It's an opportunity for businesses to be proactive and help guide the city in a positive direction. And what about businesses who might have been considering moving out of New York City because of those tolls?
Yeah.
Should they reconsider now?
You know, that's a really interesting point. I'd say it's definitely worth revisiting that decision. With the tolls gone, staying and even expanding in the city might suddenly become a much more attractive prospect.
So much to consider. This whole situation really raises some fascinating questions about the bigger picture of how cities work, doesn't it? It's not just about traffic jams and tolls anymore, is it?
Absolutely not. What's fascinating here is how this entire episode exposes the incredible complexities of urban planning,
Right.
transportation funding, and that delicate balance between federal and local control.
It really highlights how our cities function
Right.
and how decisions made at different levels of government can have such a profound impact on everyday life for everyone.
Exactly. And it also raises the question, will this situation in New York City set a precedent for other cities that are considering congestion pricing? Will they be hesitant to implement similar programs after seeing what happened here?
That's a great question. And what about the future of infrastructure projects in general? Will this impact how cities approach funding and development moving forward?
These are all crucial questions, and they all lead us to perhaps the most important question of all. Can congestion pricing ever truly work in a way that's fair, effective, and doesn't create more problems than it solves? From the outset, it seems like there were some fundamental disagreements about the goals and the long-term viability of the congestion pricing plan.
That's a good point. Remember how the DOT accused the city of straying from the original intents of the value pricing pilot program?
Right.
That suggests a breakdown in communication somewhere along the line.
Exactly. And that lack of alignment can lead to confusion, mistrust, and ultimately derail even the most well-intentioned initiatives. The city could have done a better job demonstrating a concrete plan addressing fairness and alternative options. Perhaps the city could have explored different toll structures
Yeah.
or phased in the program more gradually to minimize disruption.
Or maybe they could have invested more heavily in public transit beforehand
Yeah.
to give people more viable alternatives to driving.
Exactly. There are always multiple paths to explore, and being open to feedback and adjustment is crucial.
It's interesting because this whole situation also shines a light on the challenges of funding public infrastructure in our cities.
It sure does. Cities are constantly struggling to keep up with the demands of a growing population and aging infrastructure,
Yeah.
and finding sustainable revenue streams is always a battle.
It's been really eye-opening to dig into this whole congestion pricing thing. It's made me realize how complex these issues are
Yeah.
and how much they impact all of us,
Yeah.
even if we don't live in a big city like New York.
Yeah, decisions made at the city level can have ripple effects across the country and even globally. And it highlights the need for all of us to be more informed and engaged no matter where we live.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, these aren't just abstract policy debates.
Right. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave our listeners with.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the practicalities of congestion pricing, the pros and cons, the different approaches. But I think it's also crucial to remember the human element here.
What do you mean by the human element?
Well, any policy that impacts how people move around, how they get to work, how they access essential services,
Right.
it's going to have profound social and psychological effects. We can't just look at this through a purely economic or logistical lens.
So we need to be mindful of the potential unintended consequences and how these policies might impact different communities in different ways.
Exactly. We need to ask ourselves who benefits from these policies.
Yeah.
Who bears the brunt of the costs? Are we creating a more equitable and just transportation system, or are we exacerbating existing inequalities?
Those are tough questions, but they're essential to grapple with.
They are, and I think they underscore the importance of having a diverse range of voices at the table when we're designing these policies.
Yeah.
We need input from urban planners, economists, engineers, sure,
Of course.
but we also need the perspectives of everyday commuters, residents of different neighborhoods,
Right.
and anyone else who will be impacted by these decisions.
It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table and ensuring that our transportation systems are designed to serve the needs of all members of our communities.
Precisely. And I think that's a powerful message to leave our listeners with. We can all play a role in shaping a better future for our cities and for ourselves.
Beautifully said. Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, explored some complex issues, and hopefully sparked some new ideas and perspectives.
It's been a fascinating journey, as always, and I'm already looking forward to our next deep dive.
For more insights like these, don't forget to subscribe to Logistics Pulse on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.